It's the Sittin Sportside podcast, exclusively on 1045theteam.com.
And welcome into the Sittin Sportside podcast. I'm Eric Hanman here talking to you about week number 9 in the NFL season. And I'm joined, of course, by my main man, Cody Marshall. Cody, how you doing today?
Pretty good. We're halfway through the NFL season. The World Series has come to a close. College football is heating up with the playoff coming up in a few weeks. It's an exciting time in sports right now.
And we're basically halfway done with the NFL regular season. I think it's a perfect time to talk about the contenders and the pretenders, the classic, if you will, segment of this NFL season. And you have teams that are surprising everybody, like the St. Louis Rams? No, the Los Angeles Rams, who actually play better away from LA. 5-0 on the road now after a big win against the Giants, like a massive win against the Giants. Like not a big as in competitive game, but big as in a blowout. Same type of situation. The Eagles 8-1 right now. So there's some teams that are right now that people might say are pretenders. I mean, I know that the Eagles continue week to week saying, is this team really for real? And that's where we'll come down to it today. We'll talk about some of the teams that are up there. Like I said, the Rams and the Eagles, those are the main two teams. We'll talk to those two first, and we'll go into some other ones as well. Cody, I'll start with the 8-1 Philadelphia Eagles. Is this team a contender or a pretender come late December, early January time when we're right in the thick of things for the playoffs?
I think they're a contender, and there's a couple reasons why. Namely, they're going into their bye week in this upcoming week, and for them to win 8 games like they already have without having their bye week early in the season, I think makes them a really good team, and I think they've got a really good shot at holding off everybody else in that NFC East as far as the Cowboys and the Redskins in order to get the berth as the division champion. Carson Wentz right now, I think, is the real deal. There may only be one quarterback in the entire NFL that's better than him right now, and that's Tom Brady in New England. But Carson Wentz, I think, has gotten more of the spotlight because of what he's done with a team that even we projected to be the last place team in a very good division because we expected the Giants to be better. Mm-hmm. We expected Kirk Cousins to lead the Redskins to be better and the Cowboys to be more dominant than they have been, considering they've got Dak Prescott and Ezekiel Elliott. And now all of a sudden we've seen Carson Wentz develop. We've seen Alshon Jeffrey become a better wide receiver than what he's been in the past. And another thing that Carson Wentz does really well, just like Tom Brady, he's not afraid to throw the ball to his tight end. In this case, it's Zach Ertz, which has really become a fixture in this offense. And I think that's another reason why they're so dominant right now.
Definitely, and the defense has stepped up really behind a really good defensive line. They've traded for Ronald Darby right from the Buffalo Bills before the season, getting rid of Matthews, but they knew they had Torrey Smith and Alshon Jeffrey and maybe a newly reborn Nelson Aguilar for that wide receiver. And then they also get better with bringing in Jay Ajayi, who they lost a big play early in the season against the Giants. They lost Darren Sproles, who was their pass catcher out of the backfield. I'm not saying that Jay Ajayi is anything close to Darren Sproles. 2 different types of backs, but he's more versatile than the Garrett Blunt. Per se. They also have Clement in that backfield, but obviously he's already shown his impact on this team against, and that's the thing. This Denver team, they put up 51 points on this Denver team, which the defense has been the one bright spot of this team throughout their struggles in the last few weeks. So that is something to really be said about the Eagles, but the Dallas Cowboys are still there. We'll see, Elliott, he might be suspended, right? I don't know. We don't know for a fact, but that game in week number 11, going into their bye week now, the Eagles, that will be one of the biggest games, I think, to know for sure. It's on Sunday Night Football against the Dallas Cowboys. We know for sure that this team is going to be taking over this NFC East this year, but they're definitely contenders, in my opinion. We'll go on to the Rams right here. Are the Rams a pretender or a contender?
I'm going to go contender, maybe not so much for the division title, only because the Seattle Seahawks are still hanging around. They certainly were helped out by the Redskins win. I was amazed Washington was able to go in there and pull out that win. They were helped by Blair Walsh missing 3 field goals for Seattle. But I think the Seahawks defense is what it has been for the past few years under Pete Carroll. They've continued to get the job done. It's the offense for Seattle that makes me a little nervous. Russell Wilson has not been as effective as he has been in the past. He was hurt, I believe, or at least was sacked and fumbled the ball, which is really rare. Number 1, to sack Russell Wilson. Number 2, for him to turn it over. But that's where Seattle has now all of a sudden become vulnerable. I don't see Arizona getting back into this mix. They're at 4-4 right now.
It'll be really tough.
The Niners aren't even going to come close. It's going to be a two-horse race, but right now I think that all this hype for the Rams, I think will eventually catch up to them, and the veteran leadership of the Seattle Seahawks is what will get them over the hump. I think Seattle's going to still end up winning this division, and the Rams, because there's not a whole lot of other teams contending for a wild card spot of the NFC that I think are contenders, I think they get in as a wild card team.
Man, Sean McVay really has done a great job, obviously, as a first-year head coach in a lot of areas, right? He's made this offense so much better. But my personal opinion, the best thing that he did as a coach was bringing in a veteran leadership of Wade Phillips on that defensive end for the defensive coordinator. He's done a great job. We already know he had a Super Bowl winning defense with the Denver Broncos 2 years ago. And this is the defense that we all knew had a lot, but he's really making sure that they, in this great scheme of things with Aaron Donald on the defensive line, but even past that, Connor Barwin comes in from Philadelphia and really leads a great linebacking court with Robert Quinn, who now drops back into that linebacker in the 3-4 defense as opposed to the 4-3 that they already ran. So Wade Phillips deserves a lot of credit, but so does obviously Sean McVay, because being able to, last year was just the Todd Gurley show wasn't be able to break out because he couldn't get anything going because they would key on him nonstop. Having these other plays, and obviously the Giants gave up in certain areas in this game. Eli Apple could have made that play on 3rd and 33 to set the edge, but that also goes to show how explosive this offense can be, even on a screen pass. And then a guy like Sammy Watkins can get past that defense. So they have enough weapons offensively for Sean McVay and Jared Goff. I mean, just getting better. And to your point, Seattle's already beaten them, even though that was a close game. Seattle's still probably going to make the playoffs. I think that they are definitely a contender, and they're probably going to make the playoffs because I don't know. I don't see another team in the NFC really lurking there to possibly threaten them for at least a wild card, if not obviously the division with Seattle. But that's what I'm going to go with. I'm going to go to the AFC next, unless you have something else to say on that.
Well, and what I was going to say is part of the reason this Rams team has really made this dramatic turnaround, you talk about the defensive side. This offense, look at what they did to help out Jared Goff. They've given him all the confidence in the world because he's throwing to guys like Cooper Kupp, Robert Woods, just a bunch of guys who aren't necessarily big names, but get the job done. And they've also, when you are able to run the ball as well as they are with Todd Gurley, it helps take the pressure off the quarterback big time. And I think that's what has allowed him to go from a poor year where he was under a coach in Jeff Fisher who didn't really have a whole lot of confidence in him to what we've seen under Sean McVay, who has completely said, hey, you're the man. You got to step up, and he's done nothing.
Let's go a little bit rapid fire here. We're going to bring up a bunch of teams. I'm going to go down the list of contender or pretender, and we'll both say a line or two on whether we think this team is a contender or a pretender. So from the AFC East, I have 3 teams for you. The one that's obvious, I'm not going to talk about. Buffalo Bills. Is this team, after it lost to the Jets, are they a contender or a pretender?
Pretender. We've seen over and over again this Buffalo Bills team has trouble winning games that they need to win. They had to beat the New York Jets. This is a division game. It's a Jets team that nobody picked to win as many games as they have already. And quite frankly, they're still not as good as their wins show. The Buffalo had to win that game.
I'll go pretender because I don't know if they're going to be able to compete with the bigger games, especially coming up against the Patriots, especially in that big time Thursday game. But if you ask for incognito, it's all about the Thursday night hangover, I guess. So maybe they're not going to be as bad, but they're 4-0 at home. That's big. We'll go to the Dolphins next. Well, yeah, we'll go to the Dolphins next. They're 4-4, coming off a good performance from Jay Cutler, but they still lost to the Raiders.
Pretender. This team doesn't know who they want at quarterback. Jay Cutler, Matt Moore, I think both of them have pretty much had their ups and downs, and they've already traded away Jay Ajayi. I don't see them making the playoffs. They're maybe an 8-8 team.
And then the New York Jets. Do you think that team's a pretender or a contender?
Pretender. They're a better team than what most of us thought they were. The 4 wins that they have show that, but in order to be a contender, you'd have to beat a team like a New England, which I get it. They had the one bad call the first time the 2 teams meet, but still, I think New England ends up winning that game even with that one.
Like the aforementioned 2 teams, I think they're contenders in terms of possibly making the playoffs, but when it comes down to things, definitely a pretender in terms of making a real threat. It's not only to win the AFC. We'll stick in the AFC real quick. The Tennessee Titans and Jacksonville Jaguars. Which one do you think is the bigger contender of those 2 teams?
Tennessee. They've got the better quarterback with Marcus Mariota. Jacksonville has the defense, hence the nickname Saxonville, but I don't think Blake Bortles is consistent enough to consider Jacksonville to be a more dominant threat in that division?
I'm actually going to go Jacksonville because of the defense. I know you just mentioned it right there, Jacksonville to get Darius as well on this trade deadline, but that secondary with Jalen Ramsey and A.J. Bouye, they're one of the best defensive units in the league, and that's what we know about Tom Coughlin is he knows how to win with a good defense. And listen, this team hasn't had Leonard Fournette for the last 2 games, one because of injury, the other because of tomfoolery and being an idiot. Not just being growing up a little bit. To be totally candid, Leonard Fournette, they've won without him with Chris Ivory and T.J. Yeldon. So with getting Fournette back, they've been able to do enough offensively. I get it was a Bengals team and a Colts team that aren't that great, but they've just done enough, and I love that defense. I'm going to say that I think that Jacksonville is more of a contender than Tennessee, but Tennessee's also done a great job as well. Last division we'll talk about real quick. Saints, Panthers, and the Panthers just beat Atlanta Falcons. Which of those 3 teams do you see winning that division and being the biggest contender in the NFC?
The Saints. And I didn't think I'd say this. I thought the Saints were going to have a mediocre year. We've talked about how bad their defense has been in the past, how they give up way too many yards, and they've solely relied on Drew Brees going out there and throwing the ball well enough for them to outscore the other teams. They don't have to do that this year, and I think that's one of the biggest things that has jumped out at everybody. This team quietly has won 6 straight games, while Carolina has struggled to figure out how exactly they're going to handle their offense with Greg Olsen going down with an injury. I still don't think they figured out how they want to use Christian McCaffrey to the best of this offense and his ability so far. Cam Newton is up and down with his games, and the Falcons right now, they're in such a funk right now, and I don't know if they're going to come out of it.
Right, Falcons are too shaky for me. Panthers also unpredictable team, in my opinion. So I'm going to go with you as well. I think the Saints are the biggest threat, definitely because of Dennis Allen and being able to improve that defense. Now, contenders and pretenders possibly in the college football playoff. We'll give you our opinions after a great week in college football next.
Looking for a station that plays the best variety of music from the 80s, 90s, and more? Try Rewind 105.7. Rewind 105.7.
It's the Sittin Sportside Podcast, exclusively on 1045theteam.com.
And welcome back into the Sittin Sportside Podcast, along with Cody Marshall and Merrick Hanman. And we talked about the NFL pretenders and contenders, but the biggest thing from last week in college football, I think, was the college football playoff poll that let us know which teams that the playoff committee thinks is the real contenders and pretenders. And the 4 teams that they put as the top 4, all victorious in this past week in college football. Alabama beating LSU, Georgia victorious, Notre Dame victorious, and then a big scare, right, from NC State against Clemson. But Clemson pulls that one out. So the real question right now, and we've gone over this in the last few weeks, is that there really seems to be at least 2 teams per year who don't make it, who are in the initial college football playoff poll. Now, Cody, you're big into the game over the weekend. I know you watched that Oklahoma State game. Now let's just talk a little bit about teams that aren't necessarily in those 4, about whether we think they can work their way in there. Michigan State beat Penn State, so now, maybe Penn State won't work their way back into it. Ohio State upset by Iowa. Maybe they won't work their way back into it, but Oklahoma did beat Oklahoma State. What's your thoughts on that game?
I thought it depends on what kind of football you like. Offensively, you love that game. 62-52, Oklahoma beats Oklahoma State. Defensively, that game's awful. I don't know how, as a head coach, whether you're Lincoln Riley or Mike Gundy, if you had won that game, how you tell your guys that, hey, when you come off that field, that you feel like you've accomplished something, because there was no defense. The teams combined for over 1,400 yards, and it was pretty much like Baker Mayfield drops back to pass, throws a touchdown. Next play, Mason Rudolph drops back to pass, throws a touchdown.
Right.
You cannot win a national championship with that kind of defense. None of these guys can do this against an Alabama defense.
Yeah, let me ask you this. We've seen, correct me if I'm wrong, we have yet to see a Big 12 team in the college football playoff, right?
Oklahoma was in the first one.
They were in the first one. Okay. Is that true? That's definitely true?
Yeah.
Okay.
Oklahoma played at Alabama.
All right, right. Okay. So, besides that one team, we really haven't seen it. And I think it was blamed a lot on the no Big 12 championship. Now that's reinstated this year. Do you think that something like that, the lack of the defense, does that come into the college football playoffs committee's mind about whether or not that they don't want to put teams that obviously have shown they can't play defense in the college football playoff?
If it doesn't come into their mind, I don't know how you can compare these teams. I mean, you're looking at an Alabama team. Is Alabama who beats LSU 24-10, and some people are like, okay, this game was relatively close. It's only 2 touchdowns. But there was never a point in time that you thought LSU was going to win this game. There was a moment where LSU kicked a field goal to make it 14-3 going into the half, and had they scored right out of the half and made it 14-10, you'd think, okay, maybe LSU is going to make this interesting. That's the kind of defensive play that you have to be an all-around college football team that has the ability to win a national championship. Look at last year. The only way Clemson was going to win the national championship like they did, Deshaun Watson had to play out of his mind, had to hit all the right notes basically on that final drive. And he did.
And get a pick play.
That's the kind of play that you need to be a good defense, not a 70-yard bomb, whether it's from Baker Mayfield or Mason Rudolph over time, because nobody's going to be able to do that against these quality teams. And that is why right now Oklahoma should not be given the liberty of going ahead of Clemson, despite Clemson barely getting by an NC State team. The ACC Atlantic is so much better. It's like the Big Ten. The Atlantic is so much better than the Coastal that we're not talking about Miami because they've had an easier schedule because of who's in their division.
Maybe we should be talking about Miami a little bit. Just to go back on something, the Oklahoma did make it 2 years ago in the second college football playoff. They were the 4th seed, and they, like you said, did lose to Alabama. But Miami, to me, I think is a team that isn't being talked about, probably because they haven't had that big of a win. But that Virginia Tech game was a big game. They pulled it out, and the defense continues to look really good for the Hurricanes.
Well, they hadn't had a big win up until beating Virginia Tech, and they also had looked very suspicious. Barely beating North Carolina.
Syracuse.
Barely beating Syracuse. And Syracuse's resume...
They beat Clemson.
They did. Clemson had an injured quarterback, though, and what has Syracuse done since? In my opinion, that Clemson or beating Syracuse does not hold a lot of weight if Syracuse doesn't become bowl eligible, and they've got a long way to go. They still have to win. I believe it's 2 more games, and the schedule does not bode well for them. Miami's got another shot if they can beat Notre Dame. To me, this is an elimination game. Why? Because if Notre Dame loses, it's their second loss. And I get it. They've lost to Georgia. They'll have lost to Miami. If Miami loses, they probably still win the ACC Coastal. But now they have to win the ACC championship game and hold on to that one loss, and I don't think they can beat whoever comes out of the ACC Atlantic, which right now would be Clemson.
That is what it all will come down to. I don't think you're going to have more than one ACC team in there. Now, Big Ten, we talked about that a little bit, right? Penn State losing again, Ohio State falling after a big victory against Penn State. So that leaves with one team, right? Wisconsin, who is still undefeated in Big Ten. Out of all the Big Ten teams. So does that kind of mean we're looking at only one Big Ten team even having a chance to get in unless you get some massive losses and some fallout from a lot of these other teams? Penn State, Ohio State probably done, Michigan probably done. It all comes down to whether Wisconsin can win the Big Ten and then possibly get into that college football playoffs if they can win it out.
You need massive losses, and you need one of those teams, Penn State or Ohio State, to win convincingly. I think both of those teams had kept games too close in certain situations. If Wisconsin goes unbeaten and they have Iowa, Michigan, Minnesota left, on paper right now, Iowa looks good because they beat Ohio State. Wisconsin's got them at home. They've got Michigan at home. They'll go on the road against Minnesota. The Big Ten West isn't impressive. So Wisconsin's big win, they'll finally get a top 25 team this week against Iowa. Michigan, if they keep winning, I think they'll be in the top 25 next week and would probably be Wisconsin's biggest win thus far. Then they get in the Big Ten championship game, which is going to be a big win whether you play Ohio State, Penn State, or Michigan State. If you go undefeated, the Big Ten champion, an unbeaten Big Ten champion, has to get in over a one-loss Big 12 champion, a one-loss Pac-12 champion. There's no doubt about it. So I think Wisconsin is still a contender for the moment, but they also have to play better from an offensive standpoint. I thought they did really, really well against Indiana. Alex Hornibrook needs to secure the ball and stop throwing so many interceptions as he has in the recent games.
Now, one thing I know for a fact that we haven't seen yet in the college football playoff is 2 teams from the same conference. And in the SEC, you have Jordan. It seems every single year that you have at least 1 or 2, if not 3 SEC teams coming out in that first college football playoff ranking. And this year, of course, without any surprise, you had Georgia and Alabama 1-2 respectively. And Alabama gets a big win against LSU, right? That's probably their biggest win to date, maybe. But there's obviously some other big games to come, and they'll eventually face Georgia if everything holds true. Now, that you mentioned something in your last little soliloquy there about convincingly, right? If a team can beat a team convincingly. Now, if Alabama or Georgia beats each other in the SEC championship game convincingly, that might, and now, okay, before it thought maybe, okay, if they lose, if they get blown out by one, then it probably won't get in the playoff. But now, with a lot of these losses coming, there's probably a good chance that even if they do lose, whether it be by 3 or be by close to 20 points, maybe even more, it may be that team could still get their way into the college football playoff, and we'll see 2 SEC teams for the first time ever
in the college football playoff.
Yes.
Remember, the reason people wanted a playoff was because the BCS system ended up pitting LSU and Alabama in a rematch in the national championship game.
They did.
I think this year's proving that the BCS system didn't necessarily have it wrong. We're seeing a situation where 2 SEC teams, Alabama and Georgia, are probably the 2 best teams in the country right now.
And nothing's wrong with that. I mean, this is the truth.
Exactly. And not only that, but think about it. Even if Georgia only loses to Alabama, they have a support behind them in Notre Dame because of the head-to-head win over the Fighting Irish. If Notre Dame doesn't lose, how do you make that argument? Well, Georgia lost to Alabama, but Georgia beat Notre Dame. So if Notre Dame stays in the college football playoff, are you going to put Georgia behind them? That would only make it interesting if those were the top 3 teams based on the committee's rankings, because I think late in the season like that, you'd probably have to put Notre Dame above Georgia despite Georgia beating Notre Dame. But I would have no arguments if they still kept Georgia in. And I think it's going to be very hard, unless Georgia loses to Auburn, for Georgia to fall out of the top 4.
All right, so we have one correction to make. I remember I mentioned Oklahoma. They actually lost to Clemson that year in the Orange Bowl in that first round. And you know what? A correction needs to be made, according to Brian Cashman, the GM of the Yankees, for the manager, because, the connectivity between Girardi and his players wasn't there. We'll touch on that next in the World Series and what the Yankees and Mets should do in the offseason.
Hey, it's Levac and guys, and every weekday at 5 o'clock, we hit you off with the 5 biggest stories in sports with the top 5 at 5, brought to you by Buffalo Wild Wings.
We don't know where we're going to go every single day. You got to tune in to find out. We go in local, NFL, college football, baseball, Yankees, Mets, New York sports, the 5 biggest stories. We make it simple for you every day at 5 o'clock.
It's like water cooler homework, guys.
Basically.
We make sure you know what everybody else is talking about when they start talking about sports. Top 5 at 5 is brought to you by Buffalo Wild Wings right there in Clifton Park. Buffalo Wild Wings, wings, beer, sports.
It's the Sittin Sportside podcast, exclusively on 1045theteam.com.
Welcome back to the Sittin Sportside podcast here on 1045theteam.com. I'm Eric Hammond along with Cody Marshall. And before we get into the I don't want to call it turmoil. I mean, being Yankee fans, I don't think it's turmoil. It's just a situation where they decide not to bring back Joe Girardi. Obviously, in the ALCS made some decisions that wasn't the best. In the ALDS, excuse me, that was when the big one happened where he didn't challenge the play and he got a lot of backlash and the booing at Yankee Stadium. And he didn't do anything, terrible in the ALCS, although there's some gripes to pick. Anyone could do that with any manager, let's be honest. We could do it with the World Series, because before we get to the Yankee situation, and we're going to touch on the Mets as well, you're home for New York sports. World Series, real quick. We didn't get to discuss this for you guys here on 1045theteam.com about our reactions of what was possibly one of the better World Series we've ever had. And went to 7 games. The Houston Astros are your World Series champions. And Cody, what was your initial thoughts on these Valley Cats winning MVP?
I thought it was great for the local area. I think it really is a testament to what the Valley Cats have done to produce guys that can get to the major league and continue to be successful at that level. You figure Ben Zobrist was the MVP last year for the Chicago Cubs. That's a former Valley Cat.
Right.
George Springer, the MVP this year. What I also thought was that was probably the most entertaining and competitive World Series that I've seen so far. And I'm not trying to be over the top. That could be the most exciting World Series we see in our lifetime. When you consider
That's true.
each team had really good pitching staffs as far as their first three guys and had really good hitting lineups all throughout, pretty much top to bottom.
Right, and I would say that we are going to end up being a epic Game 7 away from it being the best World Series of all time. I think if you have a game time, if that Game 5 is in Game 7, maybe we're talking about it being the best World Series of all time. But I think Game 7, 2016 World Series Cubs game against the Indians is way better, obviously, than that Game 7, a 5-0 shutout. So there really was. It should be 5-1, right? So that's what's going to be away for me. But definitely two of the better games of World Series history in our lifetimes for sure. Games number 2 and number 5, like I just mentioned. So yeah, really exciting. Then you had the pitchers duel, really, I think, in game number 6, which is if you were craving that, you ended up getting some of that in game number 6 with Verlander and Rich Hill and company for both sides. So I do believe that it is kind of hard to look back and say Dave Roberts should have started Clayton Kershaw. Would have Clayton Kershaw have had 5, I believe, shutout innings had he started the game? We don't know. And really, when it comes down to, some tough breaks from Darvish. But to me, it comes down to just what his at-bats against George Springer, his way he pitched George Springer. The leadoff double, which turned into an error. At the end of, the error allows Springer to score and essentially allows Bregman to score if you really want to dig deeper into that. And then the home run by Springer, which also you dig deeper into that as well. That was because he wasn't able to get McCann out at home, and then the home run by Springer makes it more than so that made it 5-0 as opposed to have been 3-0 if he gotten Springer out. So Darvish didn't pitch well by any means in either one of the games he pitched, but I think in hindsight to say that Clayton Kershaw should have pitched game number 7, it's maybe a little much to put on Dave Roberts, but I definitely get that point of view. And for me, I would have said, you know what, maybe you should start Clayton Kershaw and then bring Darvish in later if things aren't going great. Maybe.
Well, I think I understand what Dave Roberts was thinking. You kind of look at what Darvish did in that first start, and you think, hey, this might be an anomaly. He may have just had a bad day. We've seen pitchers do it all the time in the regular season. I think he's going to be fine if we give him a second start. We've got to show that we have some confidence in him. At the same time, Clayton Kershaw is your franchise guy. This is a guy who's been with you through thick and thin. You've been hammered over and over and over again as far as, hey, this team's great. They'll win the NL West, but they won't get to the World Series. Now you're there. Why not give him the opportunity, because he's stuck it out, because he's been so dominant for you, to get that start in that crucial situation? That way he can say, hey, I've pitched in a Game 7. And if he blows it, Clayton Kershaw is a stand-up guy. He'll own it. And then you look at the way, what did he say before that game started? I thought he was a starter when he said, I've got 27 innings in me.
Right.
And then all of a sudden I heard Darvish was a starter, and you're like, well, you've got the guy in Kershaw who's as confident as you can possibly be. Mm-hmm. And Darvish hasn't said anything, and he's coming off, arguably, it was his worst start of his career against the Houston Astros.
Yeah, it was. He was the shortest in his entire career, I believe.
Gives up 2 runs in the first inning, and I think at that point you realize that this isn't the same Astros-Dodgers game that we've seen in the past where one team goes ahead, one team comes back. One team goes ahead. I still find it hard to just beforehand, like you just mentioned. I mean, Darvish was a really good pitcher all season, really, and he got injured at one point, but he was a pretty good player. And the one thing, though, you can think about Darvish, though, he's notorious at this point for putting too much pressure on himself. So maybe having that knowledge, if you're behind the scenes and and you talk through an interpreter to the guy, maybe there is a language barrier where Dave Roberts couldn't really get a great feel of how he was feeling going into this game. But knowing that about Darvish, maybe the right move was not to pitch him because he maybe puts too much pressure on himself. But I think it's a hard thing to say afterwards because the guy is a Cy Young caliber pitcher. We all know it. He's going to get a big contract in this offseason. I don't know who from, but he's going to because he's a really good pitcher. And it's unfortunate that he didn't pitch well in these 2 World Series games, and it could ultimately be the reason why the Dodgers aren't World Series champions. Not only that, but what did we say about the Dodgers all season long? This was a team that throughout this entire series, when they got behind, was able to score runs.
Right.
Well, the offense wasn't there. Cody Bellinger struck out 16 times in the World Series alone and only had one home run.
I'm pretty sure they had 10 people left on base for the first 6 or 7 innings, so they had opportunities in this game for sure.
Justin Turner did not hit very well later in the World Series.
Yeah.
He was very productive in the NLCS.
With the exception of Charlie Morton, I think all the pitchers that pitched in that game for the Astros were vulnerable and could have let up runs.
And when you look at this Dodgers lineup, I think the one guy that you didn't necessarily expect to be the best hitter ended up coming to the top, and that's part of the reason I think they lost, because Jock Peterson was your best hitter, had 3 home runs in the World Series, and finally looked like he was back to the Jock Peterson that got him into the starting lineup in LA. There were times throughout his career, Jock Peterson, I thought, was going to be traded or sent down to the minor leagues for a long time. I did not know if he was ever going to be a big name in this Dodgers program.
It was kind of like a Kyle Schwarber type of thing. They didn't decide to do it.
If Bellinger didn't go to first base, I figured they'd just replace Bellinger or put Bellinger in for Jock Peterson and just swap him that way.
Mm-hmm.
But that is the biggest thing. Cody Bellinger, he was the guy who helped get them there, because all of a sudden he comes into the league, he goes on this home run tear, much like Aaron Judge did for the New York Yankees. And that was the Los Angeles Dodgers. They play in a really small ballpark that is Dodger Stadium. Hitting the long balls helped them out, and all of a sudden the power, especially in Game 7, just was nowhere to be. And they also did not have quality at-bats stringing together like they had, and when you only score 1 run, well, Houston had you beat with 2 in the first inning.
Sittin Sportside podcast right here on 1045theteam.com, and we mentioned the Yankees, right? Aaron Judge in that run, and unfortunately, if you are a Joe Girardi fan, which they might have been few and far between at this point for a full-on Joe Girardi fan. I mean, everyone, I think, should respect the job that he did in 10 years with the New York Yankees, but he might have been getting stale. And according to Brian Cashman, his connectivity to the players is the main reason why he was not brought back and his contract was not renewed. But for all intents and purposes, Joe Girardi was fired from the New York Yankees. Now, do you agree with this? Paul Molitor, you're a Twins fan, was a guy who the people thought he might have been fired if they did bad again this year. Obviously, he was almost manager of the year. We don't know if he was manager of the year yet, but he's a manager of the year.
Finalist.
He's going to be a manager of the year candidate. So, I mean, is this the right move for the New York Yankees? I mean, because I just think that there's just a lot of pressure, coming on Joe Girardi, but it always kind of felt like it was Joe Girardi's decision. The Yankees would have him back, and if Joe Girardi wanted to leave and go have time with his family and really get away from the New York City state of mind, then he could. It was the opposite. It was Joe Girardi probably wanted to come back, and Cashman and the Yankees said, all right, we're good. We're going to move on, and we don't even know who it is yet. They didn't have someone that was standing by. They didn't think, oh, John Farrell will be it. They didn't have a former player that they could bring in, or like they had with Girardi or Mattingly back in 2008. So why, is this the move if you're the Yankees if you didn't have something ready to go? Because they're the only team without a manager, I believe, right now.
My thoughts as to whether or not it's the right move. Number one, I did not think Joe Girardi was an exceptional manager. He did have times with the Florida Marlins. He went from the Florida Marlins to the New York Yankees. The job he did in Florida, he wasn't above 500.
It wasn't, but he was manager of the year.
Somehow. I don't necessarily...
Nationally manager of the year.
And you can say that he turned around the Florida Marlins, but you didn't make the playoffs. And you would have to make a huge change in a losing team to get better losing team.
I agree with you. I believe they were, 70, 78, and 84?
90-something or 80-something. Yeah.
84.
So I didn't understand that. But then he comes to the Yankees. And everybody's pointing out he's fired. He had the second most wins in the time that he was with the Yankees of any manager behind Joe Madden. Joe Madden. As far as managers from the time he took over the Yankees to now.
I gotcha.
So at the time he was fired, he was behind Joe Madden.
So you're talking about not Yankee history. Just
right.
All right, gotcha.
With the lineup he had in 2000, right? With the lineups he had, I don't see how you don't win that many games. And I get it. People are going to say, well, the players can only be good as however good the manager decides to put them in line. No. His World Series, the 2009 World Series was a Buck Showalter situation. Joe Torre leaves. Joe Girardi inherits the players he had. They win the World Series. Much like Buck Showalter.
Well, they also brought
twice.
in CC Sabathia, Mark Teixeira, and AJ Burnett, who are big components.
If you lose the World, and if you don't win a World Series with those guys, you should be fired right there. I mean, you look at the line. It was impossible for them not to win the World Series. I think he had to put in minimal effort as far as managing those guys. I think there were so many veterans that played well together that allowed that team to be really, really good.
I think his biggest decision in that run could be attributed to possibly going with a 3-man rotation down the stretch. He was criticized for doing that, but it worked out just fine. Even though A.J. Burnett kind of got worn down there towards the end. But Andy Pettitte, one of the best postseason pitchers of all time, and CC Sabathia did a really good job for him in that World Series when they won in 6. But yeah, to your point, yeah, I agree with you have Derek Jeter, A-Rod, Teixeira, who was definitely in his prime at that point, and Hideki Matsui, the eventual MVP of that World Series. Yeah, I get that. And the next couple of years, he did not. They lost in 2010 to the Rangers. 2012, Jeter goes down, and they lose and gets swept by the Tigers. So he had his opportunities, but you can use that argument of he kept them over 500. Which is a streak that continues on for the Yankees of consecutive seasons, but he also didn't make the playoffs in 08. 2013, obviously Jeter was out a long time that year, but he didn't make it in 13, 14, or 16. So there's a lot of years he didn't make the playoffs. And if Steinbrenner was still, George Steinbrenner, may rest in peace, was still manager, he would have been gone a long time ago, I feel like.
Oh, I agree. But not only that, I think right now, if you were to look at the players he has right now, and I think what I would say when Brian Cashman refers to connectivity there, the biggest thing that point out to me is defensively. I mean, we're talking about how good the Yankees hitters are offensively, and they are. Defensively, what's their weakest point? It's the catcher position. What position did
Don't get me started on that, because you got rid of Brian McCann, and that's not on Girardi, that's on Cashman.
But what position does Joe Girardi play? Now, you're telling me that a catcher is your manager, and you can't figure out your defensive problems with Gary Sanchez? Through an entire season, you can't figure out to get this guy better, and then it bites you in the playoffs? And then you want to throw in, I thought he had managed his way out.
That is not necessarily the point of the manager, per se. I mean, you have fielding coaches who do that.
Well, then find someone on the side to, hey, we need to get this guy better.
The biggest thing for Sanchez was not being able to pick the ball. That's basically it. His arm's fine. He can block the ball. He can't pick the ball. And that's what ultimately, it did hurt him. That's why you should have kept Brian McCann. I mean, I say this over and over again, is if by trading Brian McCann and bringing in Matt Holliday, you end up paying $18.5 million when you could have just paid Brian McCann $17 million. And you're still paying the 5.5 from McCann plus the 13 from Holliday. You're actually paying more money. You could have kept McCann and DH Sanchez, or DH McCann and caught Sanchez. Like, you still could have kept McCann, and you didn't even use Holliday in the playoffs. So it's kind of interesting to go back on that. That's not Girardi, that's Cashman.
But right, and the reason you brought in Holliday was to provide a veteran leader to these younger hitters, and I think it worked out pretty well considering they made the playoffs and made this run.
I don't necessarily think it's all Matt Holliday of the Tonight Show and all the thumbs down stuff. That was a lot of Todd Frazier they brought in midseason. And I love Matt Holliday, but he goes down in May, June, and never comes back to a point where Girardi, quote unquote, trusts him. The guy played in 3 World Series, so he couldn't play in the playoffs. And I know Headley eventually came through, but he didn't end up getting into a postseason regular role. And when it comes down to it, two of the biggest plays in the entire ALCS, was Game 2 walk-off, Altuve scoring when he should have been out by a mile. Like you said, Sanchez couldn't pick the ball. And then in Game number 7, a great defensive play, a great throw from Bregman, but a great defensive play by McCann to be able to catch it and tag Bird coming home, which would tie the game at 1. So to that point, if you really want to look at things, that trade comes down to it. And if McCann was on the Yankees instead of on the Astros, it could have been completely different, and the Yankees might have been in the World Series. But that's all in hindsight. And I'm not sure, with what Holliday brought down the stretch, it was worth doing what Cashman did, and we'll see what those prospects do in 2020 or 2021. Last word before we cut this off.
I thought Girardi had managed his way into keeping the job when the Yankees won the ALDS and then went as far as they did in the ALCS. I thought for sure if they had lost to the Cleveland Indians, there was no doubt he was going to be gone. I think it's unfortunate for him. If I'm the Yankees, there's only one guy. I'd go out, I'd get John Farrell. This is a guy who's proven that he can win. I get it. The Red Sox finished last twice under Farrell, but you look at that Red Sox team, the dynamics of that Red Sox team, that was not the Red Sox team that he had later on in his tenure there. I think that if you want to win right now, you've got to have an experienced manager who has time at the major league level. And I honestly think that if you go elsewhere and you bring up a minor league, I don't think this team will be as good next year as it was this year.
Yeah, I think it's a little interesting. I would say I wouldn't be opposed to that. I think Rob Thompson or Tony Pena could be the two guys that are, in the mix for it. And then I would also say, for whatever reason, my mind went to Paul Konerko. I don't know if he wants to be a manager or not. Just for whatever reason, I was thinking Paul Konerko. But we'll touch on the Yankees and the Mets off seasons coming up next, as well as this great season start. If you pay attention to NHL, we'll give our early thoughts on the 2017-2018 NHL season next.
Big Board Sports with Roger Wiley.
Joe Cremo joining us here on Big Board Sports. Give me some thoughts about this team.
Every day is a new day for this team, and we're trying to get better each day. Got some guys that are sick and whatnot, but that's that happens, and we're just trying to push through. But like Coach said, each day we're trying to get better, and right now we still need to get better on the defensive end and offensively. We think that we got a good chance as long as we don't turn it over. We got enough guys that are talented, and as long as we're willing to share the ball, we'll have a good chance.
Weekdays from 10 to noon on 104.5 The Team. It's the Sittin Sportside Podcast, exclusively on 104.5theteam.com.
And welcome back to the Sittin Sportside Podcast right here on 104.5theteam.com. I'm Eric Hammond along with Cody Marshall, and we're going to start off talking about our offseason predictions. I'm going to take the New York Yankees, and we're going to start off with the Mets. Cody Marshall, you ready for this question I have for you? Mickey Callaway, new manager of the New York Mets. Noah Syndergaard last year injured for a lot of the season, but he's a great pitcher. Obviously, Jacob deGrom is a great pitcher, and he had a good year last year, and then Matt Harvey, terrible year this past year. I think highest ERA maybe in Mets history in a single season, but we know he has what it takes to be a great pitcher. His future might not be in New York, but still, if he turns his pitching rotation around with Steven Matz, who had injury problems, he's still a good pitcher, I think, when healthy, and Zach Wheeler, who still needs some time to come back from Tommy John. How much credit do you think Mickey Callaway should get if the pitching rotation turns around, which I think it will, regardless of who the manager is? And then what do you think the Mets can do to help out their outfield and infield and their offensive lineup?
Well, as far as Mickey Callaway, I think he's going to deserve a lot of credit. But also, what was the common theme amongst all of them? Injuries. Mm-hmm. And I think what we've seen is the Mets need to do a better job as an organization of keeping their pitchers healthy, whether it be better stretching, more time off, whatever it may be, to get these guys to where they can go long seasons. I mean, kind of like a Clayton Kershaw, where, he's been on the DL a couple times, but it's usually not very long, and he's always there when they need him most. The only one who has been durable, and I put that in air quotes because they've all been hurt, is Jacob deGrom.
Right, he's had his issues,
At this point, you could essentially expend Noah Syndergaard, Matt Harvey, who has caused problems in the locker room. I mean, Terry Collins, I think, was unfortunately given a situation where it looked like he didn't have control over the locker room, but he was trying to focus on getting this team to win. And now he's got to worry about all this stuff on the side with Matt Harvey and other guys. I mean, I get frustrated too. I would want out, and I think it's a good thing that he left on his own terms because I felt the Mets owed a lot to him. Luckily, they keep him on as an advisor. Mm-hmm. But if those guys can stay healthy, it's huge. Now, as far as what can the Mets do,
right? So let me just set it up real quick. Dom Smith, the first baseman, probably going to come in April. I would imagine as a starting first baseman. You have Ahmed Rosario probably come in as starting shortstop. Two young players, but the outfield, Conforto, he had a really scary injury. I'm not sure he's going to be able to play this year, and if he does, how effective he's going to be. You still have Brandon Nimmo out there, but there's still a lot you can do with the outfield. The departures of Granderson and Bruce. You have money to bring in something, but you definitely need something in the infield and something in the outfield if they really want to make this lineup better. I think.
And I don't think there's a way to piece it together right now to make this team a contender next year at all.
Okay.
I don't think that you could go out and get some guys. I think they could go out. There's a guy that just turned down an option, Greg Holland. I mentioned that to you before we went on this show. He decides not to come back to Colorado. Bring him in as a closer. He was great for Kansas City.
I mean, they made one of the weirder moves around the deadline, bringing in A.J. Ramos from the Marlins. And I don't know if he's planning on being their closer, but they obviously made that move for their future bullpen. So I don't know. That still could be a move that they make.
And I think you could make Ramos, because Ramos for a little while was a setup guy, if I'm not wrong, with the Marlins.
Yeah, he was
before
for
became the closer.
Yeah.
I think you could put him back in that role where he's a little more comfortable and not everything hinges on what he does. Some players that maybe you bring in, you could
give me one outfielder and one infielder that you think they could come to the Mets.
I mean, you could bring in Lorenzo Cain from the Royals to come in and play for you.
That could be a big get.
You could bring Todd Frazier in from the Yankees, but that's the thing. Todd Frazier was arguably the better third baseman for the Yankees last year. You want to give him up right away. He wants to be with the Yankees.
Moving on to the Yankees real quick. I think that they're not going to be able to bring Frazier back because they still have Headley under contract for one more season. But I think ultimately what they want to do is they want to bring up Gleyber Torres by May or June, and he's either going to be a second baseman or a third baseman. Now, my bold prediction is and will continue to be that they will trade Starlin Castro, start Torres on opening day as second baseman, and go out and sign Mike Moustakas. Now, that could be a liability. He doesn't have, a great hit for average per se, but I think that bat is like a dream bat for me at Yankee Stadium. I know it could be overused bringing in a lefty to play at Yankee Stadium. I know. Get at me, but I still believe that would be a dream signing for, I think, the Yankees to get Moustakas at third base. And I do like Castro a lot, but to me, he is kind of that, what do you call it? Odd man out. I guess that's what I will call it. But once again, we don't know. Maybe if they can trade Ellsbury, I think that would be their biggest want to trade him, and they might even trade Gardner because I think they want to also put Frazier as an everyday outfielder. Whether they don't bring CeCe Sabathia or not, I'll let you answer that question. CeCe coming back or not?
The Yankees?
Yes.
I think so, but I don't think he's going to last the entire season with them.
His comment that he made saying that he wouldn't be mad if he wasn't back with the Yankees makes me think he wants a 2 or 3 year deal. So he, to end his career. I don't think he's going to get that with the Yankees. So I don't think he ultimately signs with the New York Yankees. 1045theteam.com, Sittin Sportside podcast right here. And the last thing we want to talk about, Cody, is this NHL season. And I think one of the biggest storylines is these expansion teams. We talk about the New York Mets. When they won in 1969, they were an expansion team, one of the quicker expansion teams to win. Well, the expansion team this year for the NHL, the Las Vegas, or just the Vegas Golden Knights, a heck of a start to this season, man. I mean, they lost, even losing their goaltender and continuing to and Subban went down as well at one time, Malcolm Subban. They're still continuing to be competitive right there in the Pacific Division.
And you think about what that city went through. Not only is it hard to win this expansion team, the timeline, you had the Las Vegas shooting happen just before the season started,
right.
And now they had to come out and be like, hey, we are Vegas strong, we are Las Vegas, and they've gone out and played like it. They're trying to be the hope and the positive energy that this city needs right now. A lot like the Houston Astros were
right.
for the city of Houston.
Mm-hmm.
A lot like I picked the Houston Texans to be for the city of Houston. They go out and they win 7 of their first 8 games, something no expansion team in the NHL has ever done. And they're led by a guy who's been there, in the real deal, James Neal, who was just in the Stanley Cup Finals with the Nashville Predators. He goes out, he scores, I believe, the first 2 goals in franchise history for this team. And they've just said, they have to have this next man up mentality you mentioned with the injuries, but they've also taken advantage of being in the Western Conference in a Pacific Division that from time to time gets kind of weak at the bottom. And you never know. In hockey, if you're off to a fast start, what you do in the months of October and November could mean all when it comes to getting into the playoffs in March and April.
Definitely. And last thing I want to mention about this Vegas team is that the player they picked from the New York Rangers, Oscar Lindbergh, actually might be a big loss from the New York Rangers, who are off to a dreadful start.
Absolutely dreadful. I mean, I've thrown it again. We call Henrik Lundqvist the king, and I don't understand who came up with that. I mean, I get it. He may be a good goalie.
Listen, King Felix was also in the MLB, and he was not always on a bad Seattle team.
Fair enough.
So.
The man hasn't won a Stanley Cup yet. People want to say he's the best. Martin Brodeur and Patrick Waugh each had a Stanley Cup within their first.
Waugh literally is king in French, even though it's spelled differently.
Oh, I know. But they literally had a Stanley Cup within their first 3 years of being in the league. Henrik Lundqvist is right now on pace to go a 13th year without hoisting a Stanley Cup. And this defense, the defensive unit for the
Speaking of Girardi, what's the worst Girardi out of New York? Joe or Dan?
Or Dan, and he's not even in New York anymore. He's in Tampa Bay now. Exactly.
What was the worst departure of a Girardi in the last year from New York?
Exactly. And now you look at guys who need to step up. Matt Zuccarello needs to figure it out. He needs to be a better
bright side for the Rangers
right now.
Even though they played 2 less games than the 2 teams who are in first place, they are still only 5 points behind the leader of the Metropolitan Division, which is their rival, New Jersey Devils, but they're still in it enough to where if they turn it around here, they'll be just fine.
And that's the thing, is it's still a long season. They could do it. The problem is they're in the Metropolitan Division, which is the tougher division in the Eastern Conference, so they've got to turn around really quickly. You mentioned the New Jersey Devils, one of the greatest stories that we've seen so far. Brian Boyle, who used to play for the Tampa Bay Lightning, who I'm a big fan of, comes back and makes his season debut after battling cancer, and I think that
great story,
is something that is so huge right now.
I saw the package at the NHL Awards, I believe, last year, which was great. It was great. Great story.
To see this entire league come together to be like, you know what, for one night, we're not just against each other. We are supporting this player who we have a lot of respect for, who's been there.
But let's be honest, the NHL has always been about more camaraderie than I think any other of the main four sports. After every single playoff series, they shake hands. I mean, that's just...
And that's the thing, is you look at these guys who get in fights, they'll get in fights on the ice. Off the ice, they're about the bestest friends that you could possibly be. Right. And I think that there's some leagues that could take something from the NHL and start applying it. I mean, especially with all the fights we just had in the NFL in one weekend. But I think it's going to shape up to be a really fun NHL season. I think there's a lot of teams that are contenders right now, and I think there's some teams that we'd expect to be in the playoffs that may not be. The Boston Bruins are struggling right now. The New York Rangers we talked about are struggling right now. The Edmonton Oilers, who have Connor McDavid, are not even a playoff team right now. And then you look at some teams that are surprising. The New Jersey Devils. It's just unbelievable what's going on right now. The Chicago Blackhawks are another team that's struggling, and who knows? I think it's going to be one of the better seasons that we've seen in a while.
Definitely. So for Cody Marshall, I'm Eric Hammond. Thank you for listening. Stay tuned to youtube.com/team1045 and 1045theteam.com for more content from us here at 1045 The Team. This has been the Sittin Sportside Podcast. Thank you for listening.